Well, hi folks, and welcome back to the Roots series. This is episode 19. We're in the second major section of the series in which we're answering the question, what happens to a person who trusts in Christ? Now, we answered that question several weeks ago by looking at the doctrine of regeneration, how God makes dead people spiritually alive. And then we've spent the last 3 weeks, and this will be the fourth week, talking about the doctrine of justification by faith. And I want to finish that up in the session this week. Last week I used the following definition. I said that justification is the act of God whereby he declares sinful people to be righteous in his sight through faith in the work of Jesus. Read it again. Justification is the act of God whereby he declares sinful people to be righteous in his sight through faith in the work of Jesus. Now, I pointed out that the key thought in that definition is that God declares us to be righteous in his sight. He no longer regards us as guilty and deserving punishment. God doesn't take away our capacity to sin. In other words, we are not made righteous in a practical sense day to day. In a legal sense before God, we are declared to be without guilt. But we have to ask the question, how can God do that? If we deserve punishment, how is it fair, how is it just for God to simply let us off the hook? Well, I used an illustration last week of my life of crime, such as it is, about how I got a ticket. And when I went to court, the judge looked at me and he said, "You're not guilty." And in his eyes, my penalty was erased and my sentence was gone. And I was regarded by him as a citizen without guilt. But there was something missing from that whole scenario, something that is involved in justification that wasn't in my story, which makes my story not the perfect illustration of justification, but close. Here's where we need to understand a word that is a companion to the word justification, and that is the word imputation. The word imputation means to credit or assign something to someone. God is able to declare us to be right in his eyes, to be justified, because our sin has been imputed to Christ, and his perfect life, his obedience, has been imputed or credited to us. Okay, that's really important. Our sin has been imputed to Jesus, and his perfect life, his obedience, has been imputed to us. Now, God punished our sin on the cross. Our guilt was laid upon Jesus, and he paid the penalty that we deserved. So our sin was imputed or credited to Christ's account. But through faith, God credits Jesus' payment and his righteousness, because he lived a perfect life, to our account. Therefore, when God looks at us, when God considers us, he sees us as righteous, not because of what we have done, but because of Jesus. 2 Corinthians 5:21 is such a great verse, and it says this, "For our sake, he, God, made him, Jesus, to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him, Jesus, we might become the righteousness of God." The ESV Study Bible has a helpful note on this verse. It says, "Because Christ bore the sins of those who believe, God regards and treats believers as having the legal status of righteousness." This righteousness belongs to believers because they are in him, that is, in Christ. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Throughout the history of the church, various catechisms have been used to instruct people in the Christian faith. And I read this excerpt from an article on imputation that I want to share with you. "How are you righteous before God? Only by true faith in Jesus Christ, even though my conscience accuses me of having grievously sinned against all God's commands, of never having kept any of them, and still being inclined toward all evil. Nevertheless, without any merit of my own, out of sheer grace, God grants and credits to me the perfect satisfaction, which is Jesus' punishment, for us, righteousness and holiness of Christ, as if I had never sinned nor been a sinner. and as if I had been as perfectly obedient as Christ was obedient for me. All I need to do is accept this gift with a believing heart. So what happens? God declares us to be not guilty when we put faith in his promise to forgive us through the death of Christ. If we trust in the death of Christ to be the only basis of our forgiveness, we are declared to be not guilty. Now, is it fair? Yes. What was unfair in my situation is that no one paid the penalty for my guilt. But in this understanding of justification by faith, the word imputation brings that into our thinking, because Jesus paid the penalty for my sin and my guilt. And my sin was imputed to him. His righteousness was imputed to me in terms of the way God looks at us. Now, I want you to understand that these doctrines, the doctrine of justification and imputation, make a huge difference in the way you and I view what it means to live as a Christian. And we'll talk about some of these things in the next couple of weeks. But for example, justification and imputation are the reasons we can be assured of our salvation. Justification and imputation allow us to deal with the problem of guilt. Justification and imputation keep us off the treadmill of trying to earn God's love, of trying to find his favor. Justification and imputation enable us to understand how God regards us on a day-to-day basis. What does God think of you right now? Well, the answer is related to, wrapped up in, the fact that God has justified you in Christ. So as we continue to work through this unit on what happens when we believe the gospel, we're going to touch on each of these topics and some others. In terms of the big issues of life, in terms of whether doctrine is really practical, I can't think of anything theologically that's more practical than understanding how a person is made right with God and how that goes on to affect so much of the way we live. Thanks for being with us this week, and we will see you for episode 20 next time.